Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and in this podcast episode, I'm going to talk about what's important about sex to you. What's important about sex to you? Obviously, having it, that's why we're talking about it, but communicating about it, getting your needs met, how do you go about doing that? And why is it difficult to talk about sometimes? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because of the vulnerability factor. Now, there are a lot of things that we can talk about just sort of willy-nilly. We can kind of we can graze across the top of it and sort of get the gist. But sexual experience varies amongst individuals. And until you've been sexual with someone, you kind of don't know how it's going to work. There's the assumption that, at least in the beginning when you're doing something is for the first time or fairly new, fairly recent, you have those awkward moments. But, if you can imagine people who are more experienced at it, and I'm using a metaphor, it's like when you're dancing. If you've never danced together, you kind of have to find your rhythm. And sex is sort of the same way. If you've never had sex with the particular partner, it may be great the first time out. Sometimes you are at a place where you have lowered inhibitions and you just find that other things work in terms of communicating. Your communication styles work, so that seems to work. And then in other times, it's not so smooth, but you definitely have chemistry with the individual, and you want to work on that. So I'm going to talk about a few do's and don'ts. And one of the do's is feel that when you want to talk about sex, acknowledge that you want to talk about it. And I would certainly be an adult. Being childish about it, it doesn't necessarily inspire a lot of confidence in the person you're communicating with. I think one of the things to be mindful of is when you're talking about sex from your own personal experience is be mindful of how much you're talking about an old relationship in terms of, you want to do this, want to do that. I mean, we can be adults about it, but if you're doing too much reminiscing, then that may seem like it's a holdover and you haven't gotten over your ex. Now, you may have had a great physical relationship, but other things fell apart. Well, that's something to be mindful of. That relationship fell apart for some reason. And when you're with a new partner, I'm sure that they want to be your focus. They want to be your interest. Now, if it just so happens that, you're sort of going through this question and answer thing and you get asked questions, well, I think you can be tactful about it, but there are things that need to stay in the past, and it should stay there. So as far as the do's and don'ts, be very mindful about how much of your exes and things like that you're bringing into anyway. I mean, even in a conversation, you'd have to be careful about that. And because sex is such a vulnerable topic, you want to stick to the present, I would say. So getting over some of the awkwardness, it's very interesting how we can kind of vamp this thing off the top of our minds, but think of it as though you were really wanting to get some solid information. Sometimes you want to sit down and think about the questions you might ask. Write them down and, put them in some sort of verbiage that would help you memorize it. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily pull out the list and say, I've got these questions about sex I want to ask you. But you can kind of memorize. You can kind of give yourself the gist of the question so that when you're saying it, it doesn't come off so awkward. And I mean, it might be cute. It might be a little bit fun, when you say it and you kind of flub it a little bit. But I would imagine that it's pretty important, because I can recall feeling like, look, if the sex wasn't good, I'm not getting in that relationship. Because I need to know, because I'm sure we've all had bad sex, and it's not something that you want to remember. It's not something you want part of your future. And some people are very adamant about it, and well, I was one of those. So, asking good questions. Obviously, a question that you want to know up front is there any history of having a sexually transmitted disease? What's your status on that? Do you have AIDS? Hygiene. That's those are questions you want to ask about people. You want to ask about a person's history. You really want to know, because if you think about it, when you have sex with them, you're having sex also with all the other people that they had sex with. And if they haven't necessarily made good choices, well, you could be putting yourself at risk. So ask about sexual history and wait for the answer. That's a big one. I always say wait for the answer. Don't jump in and try to answer questions for people, because, these are the times when you learn something about someone. And I say it takes courage to have the conversation. But remember, you owe that to yourself when you're going into a relationship. And I've emphasized many, many times about asking good questions, asking authentic questions, because through time, these things are going to validate themselves. They're going to prove themselves to be, people are going to show themselves to be who they are. And when you ask questions, then you can monitor the behavior. But if you don't ask questions, how are you really going to know who this person is? I mean, it takes time to learn an individual, and it's not enough to say that somebody is shy, because I think we all have a bit of shyness in us. We're not all extroverts. But when it comes to asking important questions about someone's sexual past, because you're talking about health issues, and if it helps, you can both go get HIV testing together. And I mean, that could be a bonding exercise. And maybe share a book or two or something that you've read about in the past. That's great. And I've remember when I was in college, taking human sexuality. And now that'd be an interesting class to take with a partner or potential partner, wouldn't you think? Because that sort of helps break the ice. Because I remember a lot of the essays and things you had to write. You had to be very specific. And the instructors always remind you that the class, things are going to be very graphic, but we're going to be grown-ups about it. So there's an opportunity to share something academic and ask some of the important personal questions and get the homework done at the same time. So as you're asking those questions and you're writing down your answers, it's an opportunity to have a very open and honest discussion. That's an interesting segue. That's an interesting way to get around this. So if you haven't had human sexuality, then what you might want to consider doing is writing down your questions and just talking to your partner in a very academic way, just to kind of break the ice. And once you've broken the ice, then you can kind of relax into some of the questions and I sort of encourage, having your private moment, just the two of you, so that you don't have distractions. Because they know sometimes if you're in a public place and your conversation tends to drift off into other people's ears, and you might feel a little self-conscious about talking about these kind of things. So I talk about frequency. Some people like to talk about where. Some people like to be venturous. They like to go out in the woods and go camping and have a time with their partner and enjoy it that way. Some people like to be in the bedroom. Some people want it with the lights off. Some people want it with the lights on. These are things that you can experiment with, and I would encourage you to be open about some of the variables here, because when you're two obviously separate individuals and you've lived your life a little bit, you probably have some preferences. But if you want to make it work with another person, then you want to have an idea of what some of the things are that they like and being flexible to that. I think when you learn that sort of give and take, which, vulnerability teaches that if you're vulnerable, that there is a payoff. And I would say sex is one of those things that there can be a great payoff. And it's not just the orgasm, but it's the closeness, it's the bonding, it's the knowing that when somebody is being that accepting of you, because you're vulnerable in that moment, wanting, and you're hoping that you get a response. And you know what? And I'm going to go a little further here. When you have a partner that you sense is reaching out to you, help them. Don't make it more difficult for your partner. Don't make your partner beg. I think that, to me, is rule number one when it comes to partnership. Don't make your partner beg for anything. I mean, and sex being one of those. Please don't do that, because where that puts you in the relationship, it makes it seem like now it's going to become more of a power struggle. And I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to take a little break, and we're going to talk about some of those things, okay?
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And where I left off, I was talking about how, not making your partner beg. In a relationship, obviously, there's a great deal of vulnerability. And when it comes to the area of sex, there is so much vulnerability. And it's coming from both sides. I don't care how confident a person is. There's a vulnerability attached to it. And one of the things that I was starting to talk about before the break was when your partner reaches out to you. And it has to do with when you know something about your partner, you know what their tendencies are, how they ask questions, and when they feel a little bit sheepish about asking something, they're embarrassed. And some people are extroverts. They just kind of can say things off the top of their head and very bold about saying it. And then there's those that aren't. And when you know something about your partner and they're reaching out to you, don't make them beg. Acknowledge them. That's it, because ignoring your partner doesn't do any good. It makes people feel hurt and rejected and angry. And when you have that happening inside of your relationship, well, these things become habitual. And when you do that to your partner from in a place of sex, then it's like your partner doesn't really have too many alternatives here. I mean, either they're going to be in the relationship sexually or they're not. And people often feel that when they get into a relationship, they see it's a package deal. And when we talk about relationships, and I'm talking about those relationships that are monogamous, then when a person feels desperate, when they feel neglected or starved, then the tendency is to find some sort of outlet. Now, I'm not suggesting that your partner is automatically going to go cheat on you. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that when you create that kind of frustration in your relationship, and particularly around sex, then I remember it being said to me that when your relationship, life is great, but if your relationship is on the rocks, then life is terrible. But when your relationship is working, then life is great. And sex is part of that relationship. And when the sex ain't right, man, that really puts people in a rough place. Because people can masturbate, people can do the porn thing, but what happens is when you're doing the porn, you know what? You're really not connecting with your partner. And women, listen to this. And here's something I can say as a man. Yes, I've looked at it, but I don't really have an attraction to porn anymore. And I can tell you why. And it was a lady that taught me this. It's that when, and it made perfect sense. And I'm one of those guys that you can make logical sense out of things, and then it just works. I can't remember the last time I looked at a pornographic magazine. And I'm not trying to preach that I'm holier than thou, but what I'm going to relate to you is as a man, and it was a woman that explained this to me, that when you're looking at pornography, you're detached. You're not really relating to your partner. And the ideal thing for me was finding a partner, finding a woman for me that I could fantasize about rather than looking at a magazine. So that was the tip. That was a trick. I'd go out and I found the woman for me who loved to be sexual, who dressed really sexy and made it work. That's how I created a relationship that worked for me in that area. And what I'm saying to you as a woman is, if you're the object of your man's affection, then continue to do that by being in communication with him and finding out the things that he likes. You know, it's not a slam dunk. I mean, it's not 100% because it can't be all one way. It can't be all what he wants because obviously you have your desires too. But what I'm suggesting is that be the object of his desire. Insist on it. And then you can have expectations around the relationship and the investment, because sex is very powerful for a man, and as it is for a woman too. But I'm speaking to women who oftentimes wonder what's on their man's mind. And sometimes he may be able to communicate that, but oftentimes guys don't. They will speak in a shorthand, and they kind of want you to figure out, they want you to draw it out of them, because guys oftentimes are very embarrassed about admitting their need. Now, that's not to say that, when people start drinking, they become very uninhibited, and they can say some very coarse things that are very not very responsible. And I do not encourage that. I mean, I know how when you lower your inhibition, sometimes too much comes out, but I encourage people to be responsible. But when you're having that conversation about sex, what's important to sex, what's important about sex to you, being able to communicate what your needs are. And then sometimes, helping your partner get to that answer, because, well, as we all know, it's a very vulnerable place to be. And nobody wants to be overexposed. That also is a part of this. You begin to talk about it, and I don't know if you've ever been in these conversations where you're talking and then you're kind of reading their body language as you're saying it. I mean, you can kind of see their face start to wrinkle up, and that has that sort of disapproval, or you can see that's something you really have to learn to control, because in order to get people to come out and say what's really on their mind, you have to at least look like you're willing to be receptive to what they're saying. Be willing to hear what they're saying. And this is one of those things where sometimes they don't say it in the most perfect way. Help them out. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Work on it. Work on how you want to, they want it said so that it's palatable. But sometimes people say things in just the most awkward way, but they mean well. So help them out. And for women, a lot of this may fall on you because you're the one that's being pursued. That's why. So guys are having to make this overture to and come out of their shell, so to speak, about this. I mean, yeah, guys can talk about sports until the cows come home. And I know as a woman, probably a lot of you are not really interested in the sports conversation or even the sports metaphor when you're trying to have an important conversation about sex and about your needs as well, because it's really not just about him. This is an opportunity, a very good opportunity for you to really state your case, talk about what's important to you and get the buy-in, and hold them accountable. Hold yourself up to, a high esteem that you deserve it. But remember about the rejection thing. Don't do it, because that creates the resentment. And men oftentimes feel that their needs won't get met. Now, there is that part about mismatched sexual desires. That happens all the time. That's a part of life. Just like money issues, um, you know, fitting, rest, sex, money, kids, responsibilities, fitting all of those things in to a relationship takes a lot of work. So the subject of what's important about sex and when to have it and how to have it, it's as much as important of a conversation as any of these other things. And when you're willing to bring it out of the shadows and make it a part of your topic of conversation, then, it just sort of helps become a way of communicating that you're being open and honest. You understand that you can actually talk about vulnerable things and not make your partner feel small. Again, I'm going to take another quick break, and then I'm going to come back and we'll talk about this some more.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. And before the break, I was talking about, definitely about communicating. But one of the things that I'm going to transition to is when you think about people and their relationship to sex, how it comes about. Some of us learn about it through a formal way. You may have gone to classes where they talk about sexuality, talk about orgasm, talk about pleasing your partner. You may read about it in books. Those are certainly out there. Videos, there's certainly things online. There's lots of things that are very graphic, such, and I'm talking about pornography, and that's some people's way of learning about the body, what it looks like, what it's shaped like. And I'm talking to the women in the audience now. A lot of men grow up with the perception of a lot of misconceptions about life, relationships, sex, and so on. And you may run into that constantly. And you may feel like you're in the business of teaching guys about what's reasonable and what isn't. Obviously, that's a burden that a lot of women feel. And because of that, it doesn't make sex less interesting, but it just makes guys seem like they're dumb about the whole subject. And it's sort of refreshing when a guy takes time out to learn something about it, or someone that may have even had enough of a relationship where they went into counseling and started learning things, and at least come away from the experience of not doing the blame game. And I think that's a very important thing to watch for. As I shared earlier, asking questions about a person, their past, their relationship history, so on and so forth, I think that's very important. And like I said, wait for the answer. Don't fill in the blanks. One of the tendencies, I think, is when people get out of relationships, then they talk about their ex. They do a lot of blaming. To me, that's a red flag, because I understand what may be upsetting enough that makes you want to leave a relationship, but realize it's two people. And when things happen, there's two parts to it. There's the other person, and then there's what was contributed to by yourself. And if you're that person who's doing all the blame, then you need to really look in the mirror and look at where you contributed to the downfall of that relationship. So now, here we are. We're talking about the two new partners, and you're listening to your potential new lover describe things in terms of what they like. And now you may be wondering, okay, where did they learn about this? And that's an excellent question to ask. A lot of guys learn about things in not a very intelligent way. Sometimes they learn about it on the streets. And there's not necessarily a lot of good information. There's information. I mean, obviously, that's a way to reach people. There's billboards that encourage you to go on websites and learn responsible things about sex and health. And there's obviously plenty of books out there. The various cultures have ways of dealing with. There's tantric sex. There's lots out there. Invest yourself and take some of your time, your precious time, learn something about it. And there's a great deal that can be gained from that. And I'm talking to the men who would be listening to this, and women also. And when you find a guy that's actually done that sort of homework, it's pretty amazing what they can learn, what they can share, what they can impart. And it's fun to be in a relationship where you can experiment with those things and you make it lively. But going back to the part of when women, I'm talking to women here, when you're dealing with a guy who seems to not have a very high sexual IQ. I mean, he thinks sex is all about the women in the magazines and porn and stuff. Well, obviously he doesn't have enough of a clue to realize that that's fantasy. That's somebody's made up version. Because I can tell you that if they think it's all about sticking it in, slamming on it a few times, and finishing, obviously he's going to be very short in terms of his relationship experience with you. Some men have learned what it really is to please a woman. And now it could be they can get this information from you in the conversation. Now, as I shared earlier, having a conversation, open and honest, really helps with bridging these kinds of things so that you don't have the breakdowns and stuff. And I was also sharing, too, don't make him beg. Obviously, it's a very vulnerable, and you might have some, fun experiences, things we can, joke and laugh about. But, when you're being vulnerable, and, you keep it amongst yourselves. And that's something I'm going to share with you, too. There are a lot of women that seem to take their personal business and put it out in the streets. And I'm going to encourage you to not do that. I think it's nice to be concerned about your friends, ladies. I'm talking about your sisters and your girlfriends at work. It's nice, but you know what? When you're digging into the details, I think that's a bit much, because that's really something that when it's going well, then they could just see the smile on your face. So you can, be classy about it. I think that works well. In giving of yourself is a beautiful thing. It's a gift. It's appreciated, and hopefully the man that you're with or your partner, if whoever you're with, loves you and gives you the validation for being vulnerable. And it's obviously a give and take thing. Pleasing each other is beautiful. It's nice to make eye contact. I think that's a wonderful thing to do during those intimate moments. Make eye contact, because that certainly builds the connection. Because if you can imagine, you know how vulnerable it is to look somebody in the eye. If you do this when you're totally naked, when you're in the act of being intimate, it builds the bond. Try it. I'm sure you'll get some positive feedback from it. When you're talking about something that the two of you did together, I can imagine that those are the moments that are going to create great memories. And that's one of the reasons to have a relationship, so that you have great memories and do things together. And it makes it fun. And you know what? When you're being intimate, you also have the opportunity to talk about all the other things that you like, because it just opens you up. And isn't that nice? That's part of being human, too. It's not always about the struggle, folks. It's about being soft and being vulnerable and in being appreciated, and sharing that with someone who wants to also be appreciated and wants your love and affection and attention. That's a great thing. Remember how I said earlier about having to chase somebody down?